I'm no good at taking good advice, and I'm self-careless, so don't tell me twice that lately I've been so stuck in my head that I forget just about everything my therapist said. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe we are all self-helpless.
Hey everyone, welcome to Self-Helpless. I'm Delaney Fisher, and today I'm joined by Clements, who is part of our series called Subscriber Stories, where our listeners write in with something they'd like to share with everyone, and I get to have a lot of you on the podcast amongst our usual programming. And today, just a heads up, it is a tough topic, and it might not be appropriate for everyone to tune into, so obviously skip it if you need to. Sav, who is now 28, is sharing about experiencing depression, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and attempts as a teenager as early as 13, and shares things that will not only help people experiencing something similar feel less alone and encourage them to get the support they need. But this episode also gives parents and other loved ones a lot of valuable insights as well about their kid or someone in their life who may be struggling without them even realizing it. I personally definitely gained a much deeper understanding about all of this through talking to Sav, who is very generous with answering deeply personal questions throughout the entire episode. And we have a lot of holiday type of past episodes of Self-Helpless that you can tune into that cover things like creative gifts to give loved ones and holiday related anxiety and things like that. But this year, I really did not want to ignore the fact that during the holiday season, there's often a discourse that the rates of suicide increase. And this has actually been debunked as a myth by the CDC. It's actually spring and summertime that have the highest rates of suicide. And December is a month of one of the lowest rates, actually. However, some sources do mention that sometimes there's a spike on New Year's Day. So holidays are still relevant, of course. But I know a lot of people will be looking into this information around this time of year, and I wanted to help spread awareness that it's actually not the holiday season that has the highest rates, and it's just a good reminder for all of us that we need to check in on our loved ones throughout the whole year, not just a specific season. And mine and Sav's hope with this episode and talking in a very unfiltered way about this, our hope is that this episode will save someone's life. So before I get into the kinds of things we discuss, here is the info for the Crisis Lifeline. You can go to their website, 988lifeline.org. You can call them, text them, chat online with them, lots of options. They are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 360 days a year, all day, every day. So you can call or text 988 if you need support, or go to their website, again, 988lifeline.org, to see the other options as well. So Sav shares about experiencing depression as a teenager, details about the self-harm and attempts, how long it took to share this information with the parents, how Sav helps others now who struggle with depression, and more. This is Sav's personal experience. Neither of us are mental health professionals. We're just two people having a very honest conversation about this. All right, everyone, here is Sav. When did you first realize that you were feeling different, maybe to other people around you?
Yeah, I mean, it dates all the way back till I was probably like 13. So it's kind of that age of differentiating, like, is this just being an angsty teenager or like what's happening?
Right.
And then I kind of caught on, like, I'm sad all the time. Like, I'm not just sad because like my crush doesn't like me back or something like that. Like,
Right.
I'm sad all the time. I'm exhausted. I have no interest in anything. And I think the biggest feeling was like starting to feel really isolated and I couldn't figure out why. And so I eventually got an actual diagnosis for depression and it all kind of made sense. But mind you, this is over a decade and a half ago. And so
Yeah.
um, it's still something like at that time, it's not something that we talked about, but it was also like this like blanket thing that weirdly me and all my friends were kind of going through at the same time, but none of us could put words to it. We're all like, we just feel really weird. And then when I got the diagnosis and then they started getting their diagnoses, I was like, oh, okay, like this is something bigger than just like a mood change.
Okay, interesting. So you were around people as a teenager that were also getting diagnosed with depression. And then also, of course, you were around peers that you said kind of maybe had some fleeting sadness about a crush or
Yeah.
something a little bit more trivial. So at what point were you aware that it wasn't fleeting? Was there a certain kind of like, I don't know, moment of realization that you noticed, wait a minute, my sadness is not going away like theirs is?
Yeah, it was when, like, the thoughts of, like, self-harm and suicide started to come up, and it was like, "Okay, I'm feeling a lot deeper sadness," like, now there's actions being tied to this feeling,
Right.
um, and then when I actually first self-harmed, it kind of, like, clicked in my head, like, "Oh, now I all of a sudden feel a release of all this, like, kind of pent-up emotion, and I
Mm.
feel okay now," and that's when it kind of dawned on me, like, this is bigger than what I've been feeling, and then also realizing, like, I had friends who were going kind of through the same thing at the time, and so I was like, "Okay, like, yeah, this is a bigger thing that's happening."
Right. Did you tell your peers? Did you tell any parents or adults around you, or was it a secret for a while? What was that like?
It was a secret for a little bit. The only reason it actually came out in a conversation with someone is because a friend of mine, um, it was like the night after I initially had done it, and he went to like tickle me and
Mm.
like playfully, and I had done it on my stomach, and so I immediately kind of like jerked back and was like, "Don't do that." And he was like, "Why not?" And I just kind of like broke down and like told him, and he was really empathetic and was there for me. And I am still friends with him to this day, and I appreciate him so much. But that was like kind of the first time I'd verbalized that this is what I'm experiencing, this is what I'm going through. And then like close friends kind of started to know because like my whole mood in general started to change. Um, and I would kind of pull away and just not really be present for a lot of things. So they started to pick up like something's wrong.
Okay.
And then I didn't fully tell my parents that it was happening probably for several years after.
Wow. Okay. And so
Yeah.
when you say that maybe your friends started noticing changes, is that you kind of, skipping out on outings and staying at home, kind of retreating or isolating, or was it your mood when you were around them? What were they noticing?
It was a kind of a mix of things. It's the definitely, like, retreating and being alone, but also the, like, overly, like, happy where it seems weird,
Oh,
and I think
wow.
that's something that people kind of forget is, like, depression, it doesn't look one way or another, it's different for everyone, and so there's some isolating moments where I'm like, I mean, I was a teenager, preteen, so it's like I was outside all the time and it's like, I don't want to be outside. I just want to be home. I remember looking for excuses to be grounded as a teenager so that I could like avoid people. And but then when I would be with my friends, it'd be the opposite experience. And I'd just be like this overly happy kid. And I'd be like present and be like ready to do whatever. And so it was just kind of arranged, and everyone's like, these aren't consistent moods. So like what's going on?
Wow, okay, so interesting because yeah, I have an idea in my head like if I would I be able to tell if a friend of mine, or a loved one was really depressed? And being really happy probably would not be on that list. And so that
Yeah.
just totally flips it on its head for anybody tuning in that you might have this kind of preconceived notion of what this might look like in somebody. And so you kind of being overly happy like you described it, did that feel natural in the moment? Did you feel like you were overcompensating for the sadness? Were you aware that it was coming across that way? I would love to hear more
Uh,
about that.
yeah, absolutely. Overcompensating is probably the best way to describe it because it's, as we've learned, like terms like masking now, it was
Right.
definitely that. It was just like to mask the sadness. So let me do the opposite end of the spectrum of this emotion and let me portray myself as this way. And when I eventually started to share more of my story, especially through the nonprofit, people who've known me for years who might not have known all the details were like, "How would we like, how would we have known that, like, you were struggling with all these things? Like, you're such a positive person. I was like,
Mhm.
let's not forget though, depression isn't like a uniform thing. We experience it differently. And
Right.
of course, to appease other people, I'm going to be happier so that people don't have to worry about me. And like, I don't want to be a burden. So I'll just be happy, put on a face, and go about my day.
Was it do you think it was also trying to, like, take care of other people around you as well? Like, kind of taking care of their emotions in a way?
Yeah, definitely a lot of emotional
Mm.
regulation. I think especially as females, you're taught that you have to like kind of nurture and care for people. And then if you're struggling, it's kind of like, well, we'll just push this down because we don't want other people to have to worry about it. And so it was definitely like, I don't want to be a problem to other people. Like, I'll just deal with this myself.
Interesting. Did you know what self-harm was before you did it? Did you learn about it somewhere? Was it an internal thought that you acted on? How does that usually work?
Yeah, I think it looks different for everyone.
Yeah.
So let's see, when I was 13, this is the time of MySpace and Tumblr.
Yes,
uh,
oh gosh.
and so depending on whatever your algorithm was on either kind of application, for Tumblr, it was like reflecting like definitely sad girl esque, like sad girl emo esque.
Yeah.
I think I remember just seeing like a bunch of images of like self harm things, but they more so related to like songs, like they were clips added to songs or things like that. And then there were probably shows that I was watching at the time. I know, like, I think it was Skins on
Oh,
MTV or something, like super old show, but like
yeah.
the thing that like set the stage for Euphoria. um,
Right.
and so I remember I think seeing a kid on there do it, and I had always told myself like I never wanted to be that person. Like I never wanted to reach this point that I would inflict harm on myself. Um, but then when the pain internally is so bad that you don't know what else to do, it finally just became like, I need something else as a release. And mind you, it's like the middle of the night when I'm usually experiencing these heightened emotions and I'm alone because my parents are sleeping, like my friends are sleeping.
Right.
I have no one to talk to. And then it was just kind of like, okay, we're doing it. We're not going to do a full blown attempt. We're just going to do something to try to mitigate the pain that we're experiencing emotionally. And next thing I know, that's kind of how it ended up. And that kind of happened for a few years.
Okay. Because it seems like the cutting would make the pain worse, right? Like, it seems
Yeah.
like it would add physical pain on top of emotional pain, but you're saying it feels like a release. Why do you think that is? Is that because it's a distraction from the emotional pain? It feels less painful than that?
It's definitely a distraction from the emotional pain. I think it's also the ability to kind of reconcile like a pain with like a physical thing. So
Oh,
when especially when we describe like you have to take care of your mental health the same way you take care of your physical health, most people can justify a broken bone. Like you can physically see it, like you broke your arm, you're like, yeah, I know that hurts and I know that it'll heal. But it's like it's different when your brain is broken, so to speak, because you can't see that. And that's just something that you're kind of experiencing. And so being able to essentially see a cut, and especially like if there's blood, then it's kind of like, okay, I can reconcile, like, this is the pain that I'm going through.
I've never heard that before. That
Yeah.
is really interesting. So, what led to you telling your parents about what was going on? Did they find something, or did you open up to them?
I opened up to them, and I actually almost got caught essentially, like not in the act, but because I had active scars that were healing at different stages. And I was trying on swimsuits at the time that my mom had just bought me, and she saw them and was like, "What happened?"
Mm.
Like they're very strategic, but like this wasn't a conversation in our household, and so I just kind of said like, "Oh, I bumped into a table." That obviously does not make sense, but
Right.
it it got me by, and I eventually told them because I had, like, just, like, a mental breakdown a few years later. I believe that was, like, 16, 17 is when I finally told them, and, but it came out as, like, word vomit, and it was just like, I've been self-harming for X amount of years, and at that point, I had attempted a few times, and so it was just like, this is what I'm going through, and, um, parents don't love that, but because you're kind of trying to process, like, they wanna protect their kid, but they can't protect their kid if they don't know what's going on, so there's a lot of processing that they have to do, but I just yeah, just it just kind of came out.
And by attempts, you mean suicide attempts, throughout
Yes.
those years? And they were aware of that? That
They were not.
happened? They were not aware of it. Okay, so, yeah, a lot to process as a parent because when as an outsider, when I think about an attempt, I think that it's obvious, right? That somebody has to go to the hospital, somebody finds somebody. Is there anything that you are willing to share about those instances, whatever you're comfortable with?
Yeah, so the one that particularly sticks out to me is, context, I was a swimmer for most of my youth, so I learned how to hold my breath underwater for a really long time, and so the way that I thought it would be easiest was to drown, and because it would kind of buy me time because I could hold my breath for so long, but then I knew that there would be a point in time where I'd struggle, and so it was like a fill the bathtub situation. It was really late at night, and I got in and submerged myself for a good amount of time. And when the struggle started to happen, I remember like kind of colors flashing like in my head because obviously my eyes are closed.
Yeah.
And then eventually I just like came to and came out, and I was just in tears.
Wow.
Um, Partially because like, oh, I've like couldn't fully go through with it, but it was almost close enough of like, well, like your lights really do start to go out after a certain point in time. And that's what I feel like I was experiencing just because like so many things were happening. And then yeah, I just kind of came to and just ended up crying in the bathroom for about an hour. Resulted to self-harm and then eventually went to sleep.
Okay. And were the other attempts the same kind of like tactic, submerging yourself underwater? Was there something else?
Uh, that one had happened a couple times. I had contemplated like kind of a belt loop, but the restriction actually scared me. So I never like I had kind of made it, but never actually went through with anything. It was trying to see how it felt. Um, the full plan would have been to self harm kind of enough that like potentially like an artery or something would be cut, but that never came to fruition, thankfully.
Yeah. So this is all between the ages of 13 to 16 or 17?
Yeah.
Okay. It's just I think anybody tuning in who is a parent is probably blown away that, their child might be experiencing something like this and they have no idea. Because like you mentioned, depression can look a lot of different ways, so can those attempts, right? Where
Mhm.
you can't see it physically or, their child's in their room or their bathroom and they don't know what's going on. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's going to help a ton of people. Um, how old are you now, Sav, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, I'm 28.
Okay, so 28. So now that, you're an adult, you've done a lot of this work and I'm sure therapeutic stuff and all of that.
Yeah.
You have this foundation, right? Looking back to when your depression started, was there any kind of triggering event for you? Like, do you think that there's a reason why you started experiencing it? Was it really out of nowhere? What kind of perspective do you have on that beginning phase now as a 28-year-old?
Yeah, through therapy and just kind of obviously growth in general, it was definitely triggered by I was moving. So I was moving from my hometown to a new state. And this is like I grew up with everyone, this place I knew, but um, also through years of just learning, I also learned that depression ran in my family.
Mm,
So I think there was kind of a precursor, like it was probably inevitable that it would happen. but there was a trigger that kind of just was like, it's gonna start now. And so while being an adult and like obviously reflecting like moving's not that big of a deal, but being 13 and realizing that most of your world is kind of being taken away, at that point, it was pretty dramatic. And also like knowing that I had friends who were kind of struggling with their depression on different levels, it was also like the fear of losing them if they were to have actually been successful with an attempt as well. So there's a lot of things at play.
Would you talk to your other friends who are experiencing this kind of depression? Would you open up about things with them?
We would open up and it would just be kind of between, like, it wasn't like a triangle situation. It was like different friends. So like we each have our own like private conversations kind of about it. And it was
Okay.
just like obviously checking in to just kind of see where we were at for the day, but also just making each other almost like emergency contacts. I've definitely had my fair share of phone calls where someone is struggling on the other end, from friends who are just like, I just need to talk to someone because I'm like a second away from doing something that is irreparable. Um, so yeah, definitely had a lot of those conversations.
Yeah. When you told your parents, what happened after that? Did they try to get you into therapy? Like what kind of actions were taken around your mental health?
It was difficult. So I am from an interracial family, and most ethnic groups will not talk about mental health. So there was kind of two reactions to it. One side was, why, like, why would you do these things? And I know that's just the initial reaction. The other side was like, promise me you will not go further than what you've been doing, essentially. And it was conversations of like, do we need to put you in therapy? And looking back, I really appreciate that it was a choice, not like a forceful thing. So it was, do we need to put you into therapy? Do we need to find like a support system or anything else like that? And so at the time, I didn't know how to answer, but there was effort to try to get me some sort of help.
Right, right. Going back to the moments that you felt so low that, you did not want to be here. Can you describe what that feels like? What kind of thoughts are going through your head? Um, because as an outsider, I imagine even coming out of it, you can see that the person has options and that we can get them support and all that. But in the moment, you probably don't feel like there's any options, right?
Yeah.
I would love to hear a firsthand kind of perspective on what that's like.
Yeah. The best way I can describe it is, in the moment, it genuinely feels like you're drowning and you're just constantly trying to get up for air. And it's a very like unique feeling, to kind of feel that stuck and that helpless. And it's very isolating and it's dark. um, but the best way I could say is probably it feels like you're drowning, but like you're genuinely trying to breathe.
Wow. The thought process that you have when you are able to talk yourself out of an attempt, right? Like, okay, let me just do this cut or something instead. What does that decision making feel like when you are feeling like that drowning experience?
So now being an adult and obviously having coping mechanisms,
Right.
uh, normally it would be almost an impulse decision to just kind of cut. Like there's not a lot of thought there. It's just,
Mhm.
we're just going to do this and then we're going to move forward. And now, if there's moments where I find myself kind of in that place again, it's learning to kind of take a pause and just kind of assessing like what's going to happen next. It doesn't have to be an impulse decision, and I can actually think about like what coping mechanisms I've learned. I know my support system now if I need to call someone, and I think like obviously that's a huge difference from being like, I'm just going to do this or I'm going to do a full blown attempt. Now it's like I could actually take a beat and sit for a second and sit with the really heavy emotions and kind of acknowledge them,
Right.
but know that they're not permanent. And I think that's the biggest difference.
Right, right. I can't wait to learn about all the things that have helped you the most through the years. But going back to these situations, when you were a teenager, let's say that you had made an attempt recently, or you hit a low point and then you came out of it somehow, whether it was just the next day or you felt a little bit better the next week or whatever it was. Did you look back on a moment where you cut or a moment that you took an attempt? Did you feel differently about those moments? Like, did you have a new perspective when you were feeling a little bit better?
Yes. I think a big thing, especially when I've been so grateful to have survived a lot of my attempts, reflection is a really big piece of this. And so looking back, it's especially when I was younger, it would kind of just be like, oh, okay, like maybe I didn't have to do as many cuts, or maybe I like didn't need to see blood. I just needed to like feel a little bit of pain. Like I could have scratched myself just as easily. Um, for looking back on attempts, there's a little bit more shame kind of associated with that one, especially in the sense of like, oh, like why wasn't I successful? But that feeling doesn't last as long as, oh, I'm grateful that I wasn't successful.
Mhm.
And so I think like there's kind of that combative feeling of like want to you want to be gone and you will kind of do a lot of things to achieve that feeling, but the reality of it is you just want the feeling to be gone. Like you physically don't want to be gone. And so that was something I had to keep reminding myself of like, I just want this feeling to go away. I still want to be here. And so that was like a constant thing I had to remind myself, especially when I was reflecting on things I had done.
Mhm. This reminds me, I reading about your story, the mantra that you would tell yourself, "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay." Like in all these different moments, can you share a little bit about that?
I remember learning that um, feelings were valid kind of no matter what. I don't remember where I learned it from. And just kind of reminding myself that whatever I was feeling was okay because in the moment it feels like I was stuck, but more so that like maybe subconsciously I knew it wasn't a permanent thing. And so it was like, it's okay. We will get through it. And especially when I hit like another kind of depressive episode when I went away to college, I wrote it's okay on like sticky notes. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned that in my story, but I wrote it on everything so I could just see it. And it was
Yeah.
the reminder of almost to not self harm at some point because it was just like, if I'm in the thick of it, I could see the message somewhere and it's like, reminder, it's okay. Like, we will get through this. And so when I dropped out of college and moved back home for my own mental health, I was driving home, car full, literally stopped at a tattoo shop as a walk in and I was like, I get this done? And so I have it's okay tattooed on my wrist and like in my handwriting and it's still the reminder I use today that it's okay no
Yeah.
matter what.
I mean, when I read that, I'm like, that's got to be the most important fucking affirmation I've ever heard of, right? Like,
Right?
so simple and so life saving. I mean, you said it literally saved your life, just those two words. We've talked a lot about on the podcast. Sometimes the resistance to the feeling just makes it so much worse, and
Mhm.
just allowing yourself, whatever I feel, it's okay to feel that way. It's just not combating what you're actually experiencing or not denying yourself those feelings. And also what you said of, I want this feeling to be gone. I don't want to be gone. Being able to separate yourself from the feeling. I hope more people can remember that in those moments, that there's got to be something that can make this feeling better.
Mhm.
Um, so let's talk about the things that have really helped you the most. What kind of tools, resources, therapeutic stuff, community, anything that you felt has contributed to where you are now?
Yeah. Definitely therapy. I think any person who's been in therapy can probably recommend it
Right.
to anyone in their circle. I did CBT, so
Okay.
cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's traditionally known as talk therapy. So just like your normal standard therapy that you're going to and talking with therapists, because it's literally just the act of talking through what's going on in your brain.
Right.
And I think for some people who, especially if you're a verbal processor, like that's really helpful. And so for me, that's been really helpful. I've seen the same therapist for 6 years now, and I love her so much. And I owe a lot of my healing journey to her. And I just genuinely can't recommend therapy enough. If you find a good therapist, like amazing. I know it is a trial and error situation because it did take a lot of research for me to even find her in the first place. So definitely therapy
Yeah.
and definitely community. When I started to share more of my story, it became obviously very aware. I became very aware that not, or that I wasn't alone. And I think there's always that kind of point, like, I understand that, but in practice, like, I'm alone, I'm isolated, I'm going through this by myself. But when I started to share, people kind of started to share more of their stories as well. And it was like, oh, okay, like, let me hear about your experience. What did you go through? And then that was really healing because, again, it validates your experience. And so, community, even just here in Seattle, like through fundraising events and like connecting with people, being able to hear kind of what everyone's going through has been really helpful. Definitely a really strong friend group and support system. My family is obviously aware of everything now, and they've supported my foundation since the beginning. And I can have kind of more open, candid conversations with my parents about kind of what's happening now, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah.
Because when you're a teenager and you're isolating and hiding a lot of stuff, you realize as an adult that you do need your parents. And so I'm happy that I can kind of be a little bit more transparent with them in that way. And those are probably like the three things I recommend. So
Mm,
therapy, community, and then a strong support system.
yeah.
In addition to that, I am naturally a creative person, and I've always been like a painter or like I sculpted when I was a kid. And so now as an adult, it's been a lot of painting and coloring. And so I've just kind of, I'll like isolate myself for a little bit, not in a negative way, but just like in a creative space so that I can just kind of free flow paint. Or if I just want to color and watch TV, like that's been really helpful because one, you're off your phone and you're doing something that keeps you busy, but it's just like kind of a mind dump of just being able to express yourself. And so a lot of the artwork actually in my house is my own paintings
I
that
love it.
I painted either in really low moments and the painting ended up being really beautiful, or like a lot of people have some of my paintings, but um, art has been probably the biggest thing to help.
Oh, yes. I'm a painter myself, and I feel like I'm on a different planet when I am painting. There is
Yeah.
something so incredible about getting in that flow. When you mentioned that you started sharing your story with people, how did you start to do that? Because that could be a hurdle for somebody who maybe they do want to share, but they don't know where or how or what to write or what to say or talk about. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so in high school, I think I had this grand idea that I would write a book. And so I started to write out my story. So a much lengthier, detailed version than what's currently on the foundation's website. And I remember sharing it with a couple friends of just like, hey, can you, like, I felt really emotionally safe with them. So I was like, can you read this and let me know your feedback? And so for some of them, this was the first time they were getting this lens of me, and others already knew and they were just having to kind of read it in detail. And that was the first time I actually publicly started to share it. And then when I initially started the foundation, I was 22, and it was just a few months after Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain had died by suicide. And I remember the conversations that happen around celebrity deaths, especially around suicide. And it's like, well, they had all this money, like, well, they were so happy. Like, why, how could they do this kind of thing? And I was so irritated around that dialogue because I think back to like when I was doing it and it made me think of like, well, what would people say about me? Like I had outside looking in, I had a great family. Both my parents had worked really hard, especially as immigrants, like to give us a life that we're very grateful for. And so it was like X, Y, Z, all these things. And I just hated that conversation around them. And I was actually sitting at work at the time and I just kind of took my story, summarized it, and about 2 hours later, next thing I know, I had a website with my story on it and I was building out almost like a live business plan of what I was like what I wanted my foundation to be. And then it was like boom, like Keep Choosing Life was born. And that was the first time that it was actually public to the world essentially. And then people who knew about the foundation or started to find out about the foundation then started to learn more about my story.
It's amazing how something like that can just spring you into action. So now that you've had your foundation for 6 years, what kind of things do you do? What kind of things do you provide people, or events do you have? Anything that you want to share around the work that you're doing there?
It originally started from this place of, and this is still like the grand plan, but it's to essentially cover cost of mental health resources for people who can't afford them. I'm very fortunate in that I have insurance and it has helped me with my therapy costs, but not everyone kind of has that, or their insurance covers such a minimal amount. And cost is one of the biggest reasons that people don't end up getting help because they see the dollar sign and they're like, well, I can't afford that. And then obviously it creates a cyclical thing of it just further ruins their mental health. And so I wanted to create this thing that could help kind of bridge that gap between cost and resources essentially. Then COVID happened and trying to pick back up fundraising and like kind of community engagement in a safe way. It's just been more about connecting with the community and kind of letting them know what resources are available, pointing them to ways that they can find therapists. Because as someone who had to go through the trial and error experience of just literally Googling and cold calling people,
Yeah.
I want to find an easier way for people to find therapy. So thankfully, I have some partners that will provide like discounted or free therapy on my website. But what initially also started or was a part of the nonprofit when I started was self-care kits. And those were things that I like kind of self-curated with. It started with like a journal, I believe a candle, some CBD products from a friend of mine who had a CBD company. And people could reach out and they would just get sent out to whomever needed one. And now through vendor partnerships, now we have like actual self-care kits that can be sent out. And I'm currently sitting on, I think, 45 requests
Wow, that's
over the
awesome.
last month and a half.
Yeah.
And needing to get those kind of built and sent out. So those can just kind of go to whomever needs one and they can be anonymously submitted. So, or you can add your name to it and we can send it that way. So that's kind of the biggest way to let people know that they're supported. And I think it also kind of jumpstarts the journey of, well, now we can kind of acknowledge like something is happening mental health wise and maybe
Right.
it'll kind of get you further along.
That's a great conversation starter. Or I saw that you can donate one, right, to
Mhm.
somebody, or even yeah, just provide the funds to whoever needs it, or send
Yeah.
it to somebody. I think that's really sweet. And yeah, that hurdle of finding the right resources and all of that, the fact that that's laid out, I saw on your website, like all these different sections and everything. And it's like when you feel like absolute shit, the last thing that you want to do is admin work, right? Like you
Yes.
just need somebody to hand you the contact on
Yes.
a silver platter. So I thought that was a great curation. And is there any kind of feedback that you've gotten from people who have utilized your resources or connected with your story that has been especially meaningful to you over the years? Like anything that you can share?
So the most meaningful actually happened before I started the organization. And I've gotten so much positive feedback from the organization, obviously, but the one that still stands out to me to this day, I was a store manager in a past life for a retail company. and there was a kid who came in who I kind of picked up on, he was starting to isolate himself. He would just kind of hang out, not really talk to anyone, and if he did, he was really defensive. And so I kind of held him like in the back of the store and was just like, "Hey man, I just noticed like this is your behavior. I just want to check in." Um and kind of see what's going on. And so he finally kind of opened up to me
Wow.
and had mentioned that he had been going through a pretty intense depressive spell and was self harming. And I then shared my story of, I've been there. I am sorry that this is what you're going through, but I can guide you in a direction that'll hopefully help. And this being bold and 18, he was 15. I gave him my number and I was like, call me if you need something, because he wasn't really opening up to his parents about anything. It sounded like his mom knew a little bit of what was going on. Then one day I got a call from him and he had mentioned he cut a little too deep. He was starting to bleed out. And this was like right before like like 911 had showed up. And he's like, I'm on my way to this hospital for this thing. And I was like, okay. And then his mom texted me and was like, I heard that you're in touch with my son. Can you tell me what's going on? And so I let her know and kind of chatted a little bit about what was going on. I was one of the additional visitors allowed at the hospital because I was aware of what was happening. And after he was finally released and was at home and he then again felt safe, his mom had called me and she was just in tears and she's like, I just want to let you know, I don't know what you told my son, but he wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. And I just started crying and it was
I'm crying. I'm
it was
sorry.
and because I was like, "Oh my god!" And that's like when I realized like my story had an impact. And now, like he's an adult, he went to school and he's like living his life. And I will occasionally kind of check in on him, like maybe every few years. But knowing that he's like alive and thriving is one of my like greatest accomplishments.
Oh my
Um,
God. Yeah.
but it was literally just the like, hey, I see you and you're not alone in like your journey because I've been there. But if I'm still here, and I remember saying, I was like, if I am still here, I know that you can be too. And while he did hit a super low place, but like he's thriving now. And just hearing from his mom that it was such an impactful conversation to him and that like he was going to be okay was um life changing. Best way I could say that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I can see why you wanted to start a foundation and
Yeah.
do this. And wow. So he basically said that that conversation that you had with him at the back at that store that you were working at saved his life. What was his experience like after that? Because he was rushed to the hospital and everything. What changed for him when he came out of that or came to or healed from that?
The one thing I encouraged him to do was to be open and honest with his therapist, because when you go through an attempt like that, you're kind of required to go to therapy after,
Right.
but also to talk to his mom. And this was also coming from a place of like, I was a I was still a teenager, but I was like, I was your age at one point. I never wanted to talk to my parents about anything. But last thing I would want for his mom would be to find him like dead in his room. And that was something I had to keep reminding him. I was like, you have a little brother, you have your parents, and I know that they love you and it might not feel that way, but like you genuinely need to kind of at least include your mother in these conversations that you're struggling, and like we can get you help essentially. And he was obviously apprehensive about it, but he understood. He knew it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And so he started to kind of open up more to his mom when things were getting tough, and it changed their dynamic.
Unbelievable. I mean, I think, we live in a world that people are so focused on reaching the masses, right? Like and getting the most amount of followers and the most amount of whatever book sales and all this stuff. And
Yeah.
you forget that you can impact one person at a time or one person in your whole life. It's something that actually, makes that big of a difference. Thank you for sharing that story because I think that's important for all of us to remember is that I think we can be so focused on thinking in that like kind of global sense way and
Mhm.
you might miss the person right in front of you at the grocery store that
Yeah.
you can have that human connection with. So, do you do your foundation full time? Is there other work that you're doing as well? Like what other I'm so curious about your professional pursuits.
Yeah. Um, I do have a job full time. As you can see, I'm
Okay.
in my office. And
Yes.
so I do have a job full time, and it does kind of get me the same kind of people connections that working in a retail space did. I've worked in the corporate world for almost 10 years, and I have always kind of found myself in positions where I'm working with people because people are my passion. But people are also like one the baseline of any business, and if your people aren't okay, your business probably isn't okay.
Yeah.
And that's how I've always understood it, especially when I was working as like a store manager. And so even though my nonprofit is like my 5 to 9, so to speak,
Mhm.
my 9 to 5 is still making sure that all the people around me are supported in whatever way they need. Funny enough, I'm an executive assistant, so I'm literally supporting people.
Oh
uh,
yeah.
but I'm just working with people all the time, whether that be in my actual like office space or whether that be the community, like the community that KCL is like reaching.
Amazing. I'm sure this gets brought up to you a lot. I'd love your perspective on it, right? Because I think when you hear people's stories, people probably ask like, are you going to become a counselor of some kind? Are you going to help the youth, right? And I'm so curious to know how you feel about that when it gets brought up. Has that ever been an interest to you or you're like, I need a break from that in my day to day? Like I would love to know how you feel
Yeah,
about that, right?
absolutely. So I, from a young age, I had always been like the sounding board, hence why most of my friends told me about their experiences. Um, I decided I wanted to be a therapist when I was really young, and
Oh,
I was going to go to school, and that's the path I was going on. And then I remember, I think, doing a deeper dive of how long it would actually take to become a licensed therapist and all the work that you'd have to go through. And while I applaud anyone who's done it, that was not for me.
yeah.
So I was like, helping someone in 8 to 10 years isn't on my timeline when I could do it now. And
Mm.
so that was kind of the other reason for starting the nonprofit, even though I was still in school, was like, well, I can just do this now. And if I happen to still pursue this path, amazing. But
Right.
I ended up not getting my degree in anything remotely close to that. So I don't know. I think it's just the same thought of like my story is still more impactful and it's more personal that way. Like when you're a therapist, you can't provide a lot of your own personal story, depending on the relationship with your therapist, but
Sure.
it's a different kind of conversation. I can have this candid conversation with you. I can have the same candid conversation with someone walking down the street, and that's the impact that I wanted. And
Mm.
so while being a therapist sounded nice, the execution and everything didn't sound as great. So
Oh, that makes total sense to me. I figured you had some kind of story around that. You had to have. Do you have any daily routines, habits, stuff like that that you have felt made you feel grounded in your day to day, or even that you pull out in times where you feel the sadness is creeping in, anything like that?
yeah, it's thrilled that you mentioned kind of at least like a routine because I think that's something that when you are in the thick of being depressed, routine is out the window. Like you'll shower maybe once a week, you'll maybe get out of bed to feed yourself, or like you'll just sleep for days. And so now learning that routine is helpful, um, it's been pretty important to me to try to make sure that I'm getting like food that sustains me because it's pretty easy when you're down bad to not eat or you're eating things that aren't good for you. And this has actually been also a conversation with a dietitian just because I was like, this is rooted so deeply that I need assistance. And so trying to make sure that I'm like getting food that makes me that fulfills my body, but also like makes me happy because I like food.
Mhm.
um, I will kind of FaceTime or like call friends who I haven't actually like spoken to in a while. Like I can text friends all day, but my best friend lives in another state, and so hoping I can just kind of get FaceTime with her is really important to me. Um, Definitely a lot of TV time. I know that some people are like, "Well, that doesn't help," and it's like, actually, my brain is so busy most of the time.
Yeah.
I need a little bit of vegetation state. So,
Yes.
kind of just being able to watch shows and like mindlessly is actually really important to me. Physical activity, I will throw it out there, like, when it happens, yes, it's helpful. So if you can find yourself in the gym or on a walk or anything, getting the body moving is great. I transparently should be better about it, but so it could just kinda depends, but definitely at least, like, having time to decompress and making sure I'm fed are, like, my baseline. And
Yeah,
then everything else is kind of like it's ad hoc, it's whatever I feel
totally.
like.
Like, it's gotta be simple, right? Like, it's gotta be
Yeah.
those simple things to make it sustainable, and I love a good TV binge. I mean, that just honestly, any mood I'm in.
Yeah.
But no, I definitely resonate with everything that you just said in your self-care toolbox. You mentioned that you can make different decisions now when you kinda get into those dark spots than what maybe the tools or reasoning that you had as a teenager. What kind of things come up for you now? What kind of action do you take and stuff like that now?
Now it's, kind of going back to, like, just kind of taking that time to sit with it and not trying to fight the feeling, I think
Right.
has been, like, the biggest lesson because when like you said, when you try to fight it, it kind of ends up with more consequences at the end, or if like especially if you're like a bottled up person, it'll come out at some point and it's not gonna come out the way that you want it to. And I had to learn to be more okay with these feelings and just kind of let them exist almost and then move past them. And I even in like recent years, like I found myself just kind of all of a sudden like panic attack. And I'm like, oh, okay, I clearly let something sit for too long. And so now it's trying to find things if I'm like home that I can kind of do quickly. And so one of them is cleaning.
Mhm.
um, like if I just need to do something else, then I'll clean. Definitely a lot of like I have art supplies in my office and I have like coloring books kind of everywhere. And so knowing that they're accessible and I can see them, it's like, oh, I'll do that. Cooking is a big one. If I have a little bit more energy, then I'll kind of cook something because I love to cook. So that also brings me a lot of joy. And sometimes just like listening to music, like putting on, I don't know, a metal radio and just kind of acknowledging through that has been really helpful. Definitely a lot different than how I would have been probably 15 years ago.
I feel like you and I have a lot of the same life coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
Besides the cooking, I'm not a fan of cooking, but all the other stuff, I'm a big fan.
Yeah.
Um, let's say somebody's tuning in, really resonating with your story, and they might be at kind of where you were as a teenager. Maybe they're kind of middle of the road. Is there anything that you would like to say to that person?
It's okay. Like your feelings are valid and your experience is valid. And it feels hard right now, but it's okay to feel these things and it will be okay. I have to tell myself that advice, but if I could like drill that into everyone's brain, I would. Your experience is valid and it's okay.
So good. I actually wanted to ask you this too, and it might be a similar answer, but if you could go back in time and tell your 13-year-old self, what would you tell your former self in those moments?
I would just give her a huge hug and just let her know she's not alone and that while it seems difficult in that moment, she has a lot of things that she will accomplish and she might not see it at that time, but like she has a lot to be proud of. And even at 13, but like especially going forward in the future, but it's definitely like just letting her know that she's not alone. And I wish I could tell myself then that it will be okay.
Mm.
At that time, you're kind of told like, don't say it's okay because you don't know what the outcome will be. And that's normally what you're told to not tell other people. But I just wish someone told me that my experience wasn't as isolating as I thought it was and that I was going to be okay. And those are things I would probably tell her.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite books that have helped you or other resources like that? Maybe quotes, maybe even people that you admire who have spoken out about their mental health, anything like that.
I mean, obviously Self-Helpless has been really helpful to me. uh, Ironically, Taylor Tomlinson, a lot of her like stand-ups have been really helpful because
Oh
as
yeah.
someone who's not too far off in age from me, kind of watching her be so one like comical but being raw about her experience with like her mental health and especially when with taking like antidepressants because that's another thing that's we've only just started to be more open about as society is that like you can take drugs for your brain like that's
Right.
okay. So she's been really helpful for me. Like humor is a really big thing that's been helpful, so even if it's not directly about mental health, just being able to have a good laugh, like laugh heals all. So any anything comedy is really helpful. Um, for me specifically, before it became a show, but 13 Reasons Why, I read it at the time that I was like kind of coming out of self harming. I mean, it's like we transitioned to different methods of self harm as an adult, but that is another story. But that book really resonated with me because it was the first time reading about a character who had gone through something that I was going through. While the show did a great kind of rendition of it, I still recommend the book. The book that is written by, oh, I'm going to forget his name, but the founder of To Write Love on Her Arms, he has a book, and that book was really inspiring. And it was essentially the story of why he created the like his foundation. And so those two stick out to me more than anything. Like if I had to recommend a book, because it's just like it's a human experience, and I think that's what helps the most is understanding like this is a normal thing to experience. You're human. Yeah.
When people find out about what, maybe they read your story, they find out about what you do you find that people start treating you differently in any way, whether they feel like nervous to say certain things or they feel like they can't joke around with you about stuff or like I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So at first, it kind of felt like when people knew, they immediately put like caution tape over me. Like that's how they would approach me. And
Yeah.
I had to remind people like I'm not scary. Like, I don't know what about my experience told you I was a scary person to talk to. Like that's
Right.
not what I would have gotten out of it. But
Right.
now it's met with a little like more people are a little bit more empathetic towards it. And now it's a lot of like, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for what you're doing. And then normally followed by like, I've experienced something similar, or I know someone who's experienced this, or how can I be a better ally to someone going through this? Those are
Mm.
normally the three follow ups.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's definitely more positive, a more positive
Yeah.
twist these days. Well, Sav, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really enjoyed this conversation with you. And where can people find you, your foundation, anything else that you want to direct people to?
Yeah. If people want to donate or get a self care kit, you can do it through keepchoosinglife.org. If you want to just kind of follow along with the nonprofit for any updates, at Keep Choosing Life on Instagram. It is just me that runs this foundation. I take volunteers every now and then. So if you're in the Seattle area, feel free to reach out at Keep Choosing Life across everything.
Love it.
Thank you.
We hope this episode helps someone out there, many someones. And I just wanted to share the Crisis Lifeline info again. You can go to 988lifeline.org. You can call them or text them, chat online with them. Lots of options. Again, they're available all day, every day. Call or text 988 if you need support, or go to their website, 988lifeline.org, to view all of the options. please share this episode with someone who you think may need to hear Sav's story. Okay, everybody, I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for tuning in to Self-Helpless. You can find our brand new merch, Patreon community, and other fun goodies at selfhelplesspodcast.com. We'd be thrilled if you left an Apple Podcast review, shared this episode with a friend, or post about it on Instagram and tag us at Self-Helpless Podcast so we could repost you and say hi. As an independently produced show, we sincerely appreciate your support. Thanks, everybody.